All right, today we're doing something a little different. We're not here to debate a topic, but to really take apart an argument. We're going to look closely at a source that makes some pretty controversial claims about the origins of Islam. Now, our goal isn't to say if it's right or wrong, but to understand exactly how the author builds their case step by step. Let's dive in.
So, just to be super clear right from the get-go, our job today is to neutrally unpack the claims made in this one specific source. We're focusing on how the author makes their argument, not whether that argument is actually correct. Think of it as an exercise in understanding the anatomy of a controversial idea.
So here's our roadmap. We're going to start with the source's main claim, its big thesis. Then we'll look at the three big parallels it tries to draw between the God of the Quran and some ancient pagan gods, Molek, Hubal, and Chermosh. And finally, we'll see how the author wraps it all up. It's a very logical progression, so let's follow it.
Okay, first things first, the thesis. This is the absolute cornerstone of the entire document. Every single piece of evidence we're about to see is designed to prop up this one very bold statement.
And there it is, straight from the source. The author's main point is that the God of the Quran is not the same as the God of Abraham. And to prove it, they say this difference is shown through what they call similarities to pagan gods in three specific areas: sacrifice, worship, and war. This claim is the foundation for everything else to come.
All right, let's get into the very first piece of evidence the source uses to build its case. It's a linguistic argument, and it all revolves around one specific phrase you find in the Quran.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting, because it all comes down to translation. The source zooms in on this Arabic phrase, khayru al-makirin. It argues that the root word here, makr, means to deceive or to scheme, so they translate it literally as best of deceivers. And they intentionally contrast that with the more common Islamic interpretation, which is best of planners.
And the source really insists on this point. It's basically saying, hey, don't dismiss this as some kind of metaphor or poetry. The author argues that this should be taken as a literal, direct statement about the nature of God in the Quran. For them, that literal interpretation is everything.
Okay, now we're moving into the first of those three big parallels the source tries to draw. This one attempts to connect the concept of jihad with the worship of an ancient Canaanite god named Molek. So to build its case, the source first has to set the stage. It defines Molek, and it specifically points out that he was a god to whom followers sacrificed their own children by fire. It also notes that this is something explicitly condemned in the Bible. This detail is the key to the comparison it's about to make.
And this slide really gets to the heart of the parallel. The source is arguing that even though the who is different, a child from Molek versus your own life in their view of jihad, the basic idea is the same. It's a deity they claim that demands human life as the ultimate act of worship. They even call it a transaction to get into paradise.
And to support this whole transaction idea, the source points to this verse from the Quran. It highlights words like purchased and in exchange to argue that paradise isn't a gift, but something that has to be bought, specifically with the believer's life on the battlefield.
So, breaking it down, the source's interpretation is basically this. The battlefield becomes a kind of altar. They argue that this verse glorifies dying for God and frames paradise as being purchased with blood. And then they draw a very sharp contrast, saying this is totally opposed to the God of the Bible, who, according to the source, hates human sacrifice.
The source then pulls in another piece of evidence, but this time is from the Hadith. That's the collected traditions of the Prophet Muhammad. And this is the classical ruling on what happens when someone leaves the faith of Islam or apostasy. And this is how the author connects it all back to Molek. They frame this ruling as coerced allegiance. The logic is, if you're punished with death for leaving the faith, then your devotion is essentially maintained by force. The source wraps up this whole section with a really powerful line. Whether through fire or the sword, both demand death as a means to devotion.
Okay, let's shift gears to the second parallel the source presents. This part focuses on a pre-Islamic god named Hubal and his connection to the Kaaba, which, as you know, is the most sacred site in all of Islam.
So, the source identifies Hubal as the top god worshipped at the Kaaba before Islam came along. The whole argument here really hinges on this idea of continuity. The source claims that because Islam kept the Kaaba as its central point of worship, it also carried over a kind of cultural continuity with the pagan idol-worshipping practices that were once centered there.
And that brings us to the third and final parallel. This one draws a connection based on the theme of holy war and conquest.
and it compares the God of the Quran to the Moabite god Chemosh.
According to this document, Chermosh was basically a national god of war. The key things the source highlights are that he helped his people in battle and was all about military campaigns. This is the exact lens the source is going to use to look at certain verses from the Quran.
And here it is. This is the main piece of evidence the source uses for this particular parallel. This verse is often called the sword verse, and the author presents it as a direct, divine order for offensive war against non-believers.
The source's take here is that this verse isn't just one command out of many, it's a game changer. They claim that in Islamic law, this verse is used to cancel out or abrogate earlier verses that were more peaceful. Abrogation is just the idea that later revelations can override earlier ones. So the source concludes that this verse makes warfare against polytheists the default position.
So this slide really lays the comparison out side by side. The argument is that the job Chemosh had as a war god for the Moabites is mirrored, in the source's view, by the role of Allah in the Quran. They portray Allah as a commander who orders and helps believers in battle, pointing to verses like the one we just saw.
We've now walked through all of the source's main arguments, and this brings us to its conclusion, which pivots from these historical parallels to a direct theological showdown with Christianity.
This is the ultimate punchline of the source. It sets up this very stark black and white contrast based on everything it's argued so far. On one side, you have its version of Islam, a religion where you have to die and fight for God to maybe earn a conditional reward. On the other side, it presents Christianity, a religion where God died for you, offering salvation as a totally free gift. And it uses those biblical verses to back up that second point.
And that brings us to the end of our deconstruction. We've followed this source's logic all the way from its main thesis, through its linguistic arguments and historical parallels, right up to its final conclusion. And this really leaves us with a big question to think about. How does understanding how a source makes its arguments step by step differ from just plain accepting its conclusions? Thanks for joining us.